Good morning, this is Garry Glaub in Mooresville, North Carolina. Today we're on lesson 25 of the Epistle to the Hebrews, and we're covering Hebrews chapter 11, verses 23 through 40. This one's called The Hall of Faith, Part 2. This chapter in Hebrews reminds us that life is not easy. If it were easy, faith would not be nearly as important. For it is our faith in God that carries us through difficulties. The faith of Noah carried him, along with his family, from a world that was being destroyed to a new world with all possibilities remaining. For anyone who ever has desired a fresh start, it certainly was there for Noah and family. Abraham had the faith to take whatever God gave him, and God used that faith and humbleness to begin the descendants of the Jewish nation. The blood of Abraham still exists today in those descendants, though the faith of those descendants is mostly dormant. But God has a plan, and the faith of the Jews will change, maybe soon. For each of us who believe, our faith will lead us to a heavenly home, a world without strife, a world without sin, and a world without tears. We cannot read these stories of the heroes of faith, members of the Hall of Faith, without understanding that God had a plan in their lives, just as He has a plan in ours. One of our challenges is to walk in faith, as we might be a part of God's plan in someone else's life. Okay, let's return to Hebrews 11. Hebrews 11 verses 23 through 29 says this: By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden 3 months by his parents, because they saw he was a beautiful child, and they were not afraid of the king's command. By faith, Moses, when he became of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt. For he looked to the reward. By faith, he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. By faith he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood, lest he who destroyed the firstborn should touch them. By faith they passed through the Red Sea as by dry land, whereas the Egyptians, attempting to do so, were drowned. Moses had 3 40-year periods in his life, according to Acts 23. Until he was 40, Moses was in the court of Pharaoh and lived as Pharaoh's adopted grandson, as Pharaoh's daughter had adopted Moses as an infant. Moses became interested in his Jewish roots, and at that time the Jews were slaves in Egypt. At 40, after killing a man, Moses left Pharaoh's court for the wilderness. While in the wilderness, Moses met God, heard God, and his life changed. After spending 40 years in the wilderness, Moses finished life by leading the children of Israel from Egypt to the promised land. There's something special about the wilderness, though it might not seem so special when we are in its midst. Many people who turn to Jesus find him by looking up from the gutter as they have come to the end of themselves. The end of ourselves is a great place to find the beginning of God. Symbolically, the wilderness is a place of testing, and is certainly a place of God's provision as well. It also can be a place of discipline. Jesus was tested in the wilderness, and Moses spent 40 years there in preparation for his mighty task to come. We might feel alone when in the wilderness, but God is there with us, just as he appeared to Moses and changed his life. God took Moses on a journey from the world to the wilderness to the walk. Moses willingly left the world, which included wealth and ease, and found himself in the wilderness where he found God. God prepared him and gave Moses abilities and power he either did not previously have or didn't know he had. Moses had a problem with speech and might have stuttered, but God used him to speak to the king of the world at that time. Even though Pharaoh was the grandfather of Moses, he must have been surprised with the change in power and faith in Moses. What Moses learned in the wilderness prepared him for a 40-year walk, leading the seemingly unleadable children of Israel. When Moses died without entering the promised land, God hid the bones of Moses so no one could disturb them, as the archangel Michael and Satan were fighting over the bones. But Moses did reach the ultimate promised land, heaven, and returned to the promised land on earth in the land of Israel at the Mount of Transfiguration during the ministry of Jesus. Moses walked by faith, not by sight. If he had walked by sight, he would have abandoned the unbelieving mass of people. There's something else worth noting included in this section. Hebrews 11:25 mentions that Moses chose to follow God's will instead of the passing pleasures of sin, or the temporary pleasures of sin in the NASB version. For most of us, that phrase will resonate. If sin had no pleasure, we would not be drawn to it so strongly. But those pleasures are temporary, if not momentary. I remember teaching a Bible study for a year to 3 young men who were in rehab for various drug addictions. One's drug of choice was heroin, and having no personal experience with drugs, I did not completely grasp its hold on him. He explained that the first time he did heroin, it was the highest high of all time. Subsequently, the next time he did heroin, he only could get back to the highest high by taking more heroin. And each time he used, he continued to chase that first high and increase the dosage. And so the journey continued. Finally, with heroin users, the amount of the drug they take will kill them, usually when the body forgets to breathe. Our sin addiction is not much different. The temporary pleasure that comes from sin is never as pleasurable as we remember. If we continue in our addiction to sin, it also leads to death. Okay, let's continue in Hebrews 11. Hebrews 11 verses 30 through 38 says this: By faith, the walls of Jericho fell down after they were encircled for 7 days. By faith, the harlot Rahab did not perish with those who did not believe when she had received the spies with peace. And what more shall I say? For the time would fail me to tell of Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah, also of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith subdued kingdoms, worked righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, out of weakness were made strong, became valiant in battle, turned to flight the armies of the aliens. Women received their dead raised to life again. Others were tortured, not accepting deliverance, that they might obtain a better resurrection. Still others had trial of mockings and scourgings, yes, and of chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, were tempted, were slain with the sword. They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts and mountains, in dens and caves of the earth. So after reading about a murderer in the Hall of Faith, the next hero was a prostitute. Rahab was almost always referred to as Rahab the harlot in the Bible, and it makes me hope that is not her nickname in heaven. Wouldn't it be horrible to be known for the failures in our lives rather than the successes, especially with that name, for all of eternity? Regardless, she made the Hall of Faith, so God is certainly calling attention to what she did for him. Her life certainly changed greatly, and it is not because Rahab went to Rehab. Before Joshua fought the Battle of Jericho, Rahab welcomed the spies and also helped them escape before God destroyed that walled city. As we all remember, the walls came tumbling down. What is more amazing about Rahab than the fact that she was a prostitute is that she was the great-great-grandmother of King David and is an ancestor of both Mary and Joseph, as she is listed in the genealogies of both Luke and Matthew. She's an ancestor of Jesus. That tells us much more about God than it tells us about Rahab. Instead of choosing ancestors for Jesus of pristine reputation, God even chose a prostitute. This is yet another way that God teaches us about forgiveness. But maybe it also tells us that for mankind, unlike God, forgive and forget is pretty difficult. We honor her in the Hall of Faith, but still remember she was a prostitute. At least we know that God has chosen to forget our sin. Others mentioned here are Gideon, Barak. Yes, at one time there was a godly Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, and the prophets. The prophets are not mentioned by name here, kind of like the first season of Gilligan's Island, when the Professor and Mary Ann were just referred to as "and the rest" in the theme song. But if we read the Old Testament, it is very easy to see who those major prophets and minor prophets were, even if not named here. David went from shepherd boy to king to murderer and adulterer, and was also a man after God's own heart. That demonstrates that David understood he was a sinner, and more importantly, understood God's gift of forgiveness. We can see David's heart in his repentance, and his walk by faith improved after his failures. And again, we get to see God's own heart in that process as well. He does not choose the perfect, but instead picks people he will perfect. Again, that is not because we are sinless, but because God will complete his work in us. Let's finish Hebrews 11. Hebrews 11 verses 39 through 40 says this, "And all these, having obtained a good testimony through faith, did not receive the promise, God having provided something better for us, that they should not be made perfect apart from us." As believers, God walks with us. In this passage, we are reminded that those walks are not going to be easy. Of all the people named here, King David seems to be the only one to have financial ease. But that did not make David's life so easy either. The people described here included those who were tortured, stoned, sawed in half, along with other descriptive events that marked the lives of those heroes of faith. We live in one of the most prosperous nations on the earth and complain when we are inconvenienced with any hardship. In case we have forgotten, this is not our home. God created a perfect world for perfect people, but our sin changed all of that. Since that time, God gave Satan dominion over this earth, and sin permeates every aspect of this world. Our only chance is a relationship with our Creator, who calls us to walk by faith. That is to walk in a belief in who He is and what promises He has made to us in His Word, regardless of what we see with our eyes. New Testament believers were not listed here, and it would have been viewed as arrogant if Paul was listed here, especially if Paul wrote Hebrews, as some think. But the Hall of Faith did not end with the Old Testament. We are challenged to walk with the same faith in which our heroes of the Bible walked before us. That is how we can affect this dark and dying world. God has made promises to us, and while some of those promises involve our lives on this earth, His ultimate promise is in reference to our eternity. With Him forever. Glory. This is Garry Glaub in Mooresville, North Carolina. Have a blessed day.